Are you an APUSH student who has no idea what the heck has been happening throughout periods 1 through 6 because either you haven't been paying attention or your APUSH teacher has utterly failed you? Well, have no fear, because as an APUSH reader myself, I can give you a solid rundown of all the periods so you don't have to use ChatGPT to summarize for you the day before your APUSH test instead. Period 1 starts with emphasizing the fact that Native American cultures were extremely diverse. For example, in the eastern woodlands where there was a lot of forests and fertile land, farming, hunting, and fishing was the main food source, as well as Native Americans lived in very complex societies where even confederacies were formed, like the Iroquois Confederacy. In the Great Plains, where there was a lot of flat, open grasslands, Native Americans resorted to bison hunting for their food source, as well as they lived a very nomadic lifestyle and in tribes. In the Pacific Northwest, where there was a lot of rainforests and abundant rivers, Native Americans primarily resorted to fishing and lived in very stratified societies with chiefs. In the Mississippi Valley, where there was a lot of major rivers like the Mississippi River and the Ohio River, Native Americans also resorted to fishing and even farming. And they also had very complex societies like chiefdoms, as well as mound building cultures. In the Great Basin, where there was a lot of dry deserts with very limited resources, Native Americans resorted to hunting and gathering, and they lived in very small family groups and temporary shelters. Two notable Native American civilizations were the Aztec and Inca. The next notable thing in this period was European exploration. Europeans were particularly motivated by the 3 G's: God, glory, and gold. So they wanted to spread their religion, which is Christianity, they wanted to gain power, and they wanted money. They were also motivated because of inventions like the compass that made traveling much more accessible and easier. Some notable European explorers were Christopher Columbus, Hernán Cortés, and Francisco Pizarro. Christopher Columbus was the first European to find America and was the reason for the Columbian Exchange. Hernán was a conquistador, Spanish for conqueror, that took over the Aztec Empire. Francisco was also a conquistador that took over the Inca Empire. Spanish colonization led to the use of the encomienda system in order to exploit Native Americans. The encomienda system was a system where conquistadors were given the right to use Native Americans for labor in exchange for giving natives protection as well as education about Christianity. European colonization in general also led to the Columbian Exchange, which was an exchange between the New and Old Worlds that consisted of food, animals, people, and even diseases. Although the Columbian Exchange was positive in the way resources were being exchanged, it also led to millions of Native Americans' deaths, as well as it led to the encouraging use of slavery. Period 2 is all about what life was like in the early colonization of the Americas. The first permanent English settlement at this time was Jamestown. It was funded by a joint stock company called the Virginia Company, and it was mainly established because the British were searching for gold. In its early years, however, Jamestown went through a lot of negative impacts, one being the fact that it was located in a swampy area with lots of diseases like malaria. There was also a lot of food shortages, which caused more than half of the early settlers to die. During the period of food shortages, which was referred to as starving time, a man named Captain John Smith took control of Jamestown and made a strict policy of "he who does not work shall not eat." He also helped protect the town from Native Americans, primarily the Powhatans, as there was a lot of conflict between the two groups. However, even with John Smith, conflicts continued with Native American tribes like the Pequot tribe, which led to the Pequot Wars. These wars resulted in territorial expansion for the settlers. Another prominent war that happened with Native American tribes was King Philip's War. It led to overall defeat for Native Americans, and it was important because it ended Native resistance towards settlers in New England. Another important development for Jamestown was John Rolfe, who successfully made a high-quality hybrid of tobacco that saved Jamestown because the tobacco sold for lots of money. After Jamestown came the Plymouth Colony. Plymouth was founded by the Pilgrims, also known as Separatists. Plymouth was founded as a way of giving pilgrims a place where they could have religious freedom, and it was where the Mayflower Compact was created, which was not only the colony's founding document, but was also the first form of self-government in the Americas. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by Puritans who were guided under John Winthrop. His main goal was to make a perfect religious society, of which he called a city upon a hill. Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire were all similar to Plymouth and Massachusetts because they were also heavily influenced by religion and had a lot of self-governing ideas like town meetings and voting. All of these colonies were known as the New England colonies. The middle colonies were New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. These colonies were known for their fertile soil as well as the diverse religious and ethnic groups that lived within them. There was a lot of freedom in these particular colonies when it came to religion. The southern colonies were the Carolinas and Georgias. It's important to know that although Virginia and Maryland are the Chesapeake colonies, which refers to how the colonies are centered on Chesapeake Bay, both of these colonies had the same characteristics as the southern colonies. North Carolina consisted of small farms and no slavery, while South Carolina consisted of very large plantations that relied on slave labor and cash crops. All of the southern colonies, with North Carolina being a slight exception, had a lot of farms, used as slaves, and relied on cash crops. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses was created, which was a representative assembly of Virginia. This was another example of self-governance during this time. Virginia was also the first colony to introduce African slave trading, which led to developing the triangular trade, which was a trading system that linked the Americas, Europe, and Africa together, where raw materials, manufactured goods, and enslaved Africans were passed. Another labor system that was used was indentured servitude, which is where Europeans worked for a certain number of years in exchange for room and board in the Americas. One thing that developed throughout all of the 13 colonies was mercantilism. Mercantilism was an economic policy that maximized exports while minimizing imports. This policy led to the Navigation Acts, which banned the colonies from trading with countries other than Britain. The Great Awakening was another idea that swept over the colonies during this time. It was a religious movement that promoted religious diversity and experiences. Through periods 3 through 5, I decided to split the events into eras since a lot happened between these specific periods. The first era in period 3 is the snowball effect era. This era comprises all the events that are before the American Revolution. The first major event is the French and Indian War, which is also referred to as the 7 Years' War. It was a war between Britain and France that ultimately led to the Treaty of Paris, which expanded Britain's territory in America. This war actually created a lot of debt for Britain, so as a result, Britain decided to not only prevent Americans from moving west in order to not get into another war with Native Americans with the proclamation of 1763, but the country also decided to heavily tax the colonies. This caused Americans to start boycotting by doing things like not buying British tea, and it also led to the formation of the Sons of Liberty, which is a group that tried to fight taxation through doing things like tar and feathering tax collectors. Another event that made the colonists even more mad was the Boston Massacre. This was where colonists were harassing British soldiers and throwing rocks at them and protesting against them, which led to the British soldiers killing 5 colonists. The colonists then proceeded to paint this ordeal as a massacre when in fact it was technically an act of self-defense. After this, in order to get revenge, the Boston Tea Party ensued, which was where colonists dumped a shipment of British tea into the Boston harbor. This event led to what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts to be released, which was a series of acts against the colonies released by King George III. After this, the First Continental Congress was created, which was the last straw before the American Revolution and the war against Britain started, as King George III saw the First Continental Congress as an act of rebellion against Britain. So after the First Continental Congress is when we start entering the Pledge of Allegiance era, which is where the American Revolution takes place. So in this era, there are 3 important battles that you need to know. The first being the Battle of Saratoga. The Battle of Saratoga was very important because it was the turning point of the American Revolutionary War, as in this battle, the Americans finally won against Britain, which convinced France to join Americans as their ally to fight against Britain. And without France, we most likely would have not won the war. The second battle was Battle of Bunker Hill, which was fought very early in the American Revolutionary War. And this war was a very costly victory for the British, as they suffered a lot of heavy casualties and deaths, basically, which gave the Americans hope, even though they lost this battle. The third battle was the Battle of Yorktown. This was the last major battle of the American Revolutionary War, and it basically was where the British surrendered against the American and French forces. Another important event during the American Revolution was the Second Continental Congress, as it was where the Declaration of Independence was planned and adopted, and it was also where the Continental Army was created. The Articles of Confederation was also created during the American Revolution, and this was very important because it was the first constitution of the U.S. Although the Articles of Confederation did fail, it was a very big step towards America's independence. After the American Revolution came Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton, and they favored a strong central government, supported loose interpretation of the Constitution, emphasized manufacturing and trade, and were Anglophiles, which means that they were pro-British. Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, were led by Thomas Jefferson, and they favored strong state governments, supported strict interpretation of the Constitution, emphasized agriculture and rural life, and were Francophiles, meaning they were pro-French. Period 4 starts with the Thomas Jefferson era. This was the era where Thomas Jefferson was president. The first term that you have to know is Jeffersonian democracy. This is just a fancy term for his Democratic Republican views. So, as stated in period 3, Democratic Republicans believed in the importance of farmers, eliminated federal government, popular sovereignty, which is a fancy term for the people getting to vote, and opposition to a national bank. The next important thing that happened during the Thomas Jefferson era was Marbury v. Madison. This was a court case that established judicial review, meaning that the Supreme Court could declare laws unconstitutional. One important thing that Thomas Jefferson did during his presidency was making the Louisiana Purchase. This was a purchase where basically Thomas Jefferson bought land from the French, meaning that he expanded the U.S. by double, basically, which paved the way for westward expansion later on. The War of 1812 was a very useless war between U.S. and the British, and it actually led to the demise of the Federalist Party. However, it was positive in the sense that it made Americans more patriotic, since even though the war ended in a stalemate, the Americans still viewed it as a win against the British. One thing we start seeing in this period is America starting to become more sectionalized through the Missouri Compromise, which is basically a compromise where it made Missouri a slave state and Maine a free state and prohibited slavery in the north of the 3630 latitude line. This foreshadows basically the Civil War and America becoming even more sectionalized in the next period. The last really important thing that happened in the Thomas Jefferson era was the Monroe Doctrine. This doctrine was basically America putting its foot down and prohibiting Europeans from colonizing America. After the Monroe Doctrine comes the Andrew Jackson era, which was Andrew Jackson's presidency. He believed in Jacksonian democracy, which was very similar to Jeffersonian democracy, except he also supported Indian removal, which wasn't really seen in Jeffersonian democracy. Andrew Jackson was seen actually as a very corrupt president because not only did he cause the nullification crisis, but he also had the spoil system, which was a system where he basically hired people that were loyal to him. And he also believed in pet banks, which was basically state-run banks that he supported because those banks were loyal to him. And he did not believe in a national bank, which was the purpose of this political cartoon on the right, where he's pictured as a king, because it shows how people believed that he was abusing his powers as a president. One very important event that happened during Andrew Jackson's presidency was the Market Revolution, which was where instead of Americans, working in very small family businesses and farms, they started to shift to working in factories and in a more commercial economy. This then led to the Transportation Revolution, which is where roads, canals, and railroads started being built, like the B&O Railroad and the Erie Canal. Other important events were the Panic of 1837, for example, which was an economic depression that was caused by the collapse of the banking system. And it was basically the first economic scare for America at this point. The second event that happened during this era was the Second Great Awakening, which was another religious movement just like the First Great Awakening. Another new movement that came up was the abolitionist movement, where people were trying to end slavery, like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass. Period 5 starts with the straight up stealing era. This era was all about Americans moving west and expanding. And they wanted to do this because of manifest destiny. So manifest destiny was the idea that God gave Americans permission to expand west. And this was a very harmful idea because not only did it lead to a lot of Native American massacres, but it also, in general, just led to a lot of conflicts, like the Mexican-American War, for example. After the idea of manifest destiny became really popular, came the annexation of Texas. So, to give some backstory on this, basically, Mexico gave free land in Texas to Americans if they moved to Texas. This eventually led to a lot of conflict with Americans and Mexicans because Americans wanted to end slavery in the region while Mexicans were against that. And overall, Americans in the Texas region did not like the authoritarian rule that Mexico used. So what Americans did was they eventually, in around 1836, became independent from Texas. And Mexico did not recognize Texas's independence. And later on, Americans in the Texas region decided to vote on adding Texas to America. And Polk, which was the president at the time, said yes to this because he was a big believer in manifest destiny and wanted the extra territory. And this was an issue because America did not inform Mexico first about the Texas becoming an American state. So this then led to the Mexican-American War, which was caused by manifest destiny, Texas's annexation, and President Polk claiming that Mexicans shed American blood on American soil. And this stemmed from the skirmish that occurred where Mexican troops attacked U.S. military in the territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, which is technically Mexican territory. So Polk basically lied about this to have even more justification to go to war with Mexico. The outcome of the Mexican-American War was that the U.S. won, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was created, which gave U.S. a lot of land from Mexico. What also happened after the Mexican-American War was that sectionalism actually increased in America, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, for example, which let citizens of Nebraska and Kansas decide in slavery through popular sovereignty. This was an issue because not only did it repeal the Missouri Compromise, it also just acted as a band-aid to a very large conflict of anti-slavery and pro-slavery. And in fact, the Kansas-Nebraska Act actually led to Bleeding Kansas, which was an event where pro-slavery and anti-slavery citizens actually came against each other and fought, basically, about this issue. Other things that occurred were cases like the Dred Scott v. Sanford case, which declared African Americans as not being citizens. And, for example, Tom's Cabin also happened during this era, which was a book that was justifying anti-slavery and calling slavery immoral. So, after Lincoln, who was a Republican, became president, 11 southern states proceeded to secede, which created the Confederacy. This then led to the Civil War. Two battles that come up a lot from the Civil War are the Battle of Antietam and Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest day in American history, and the Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in the Civil War where the Union's victory actually significantly weakened the Confederate Army. In the end, the Union won the Civil War, and after the Civil War was the Reconstruction era, which was a period of the Union trying to bring the South back into the Union. Although the Reconstruction era was actually able to succeed at giving Black people their basic human rights, it actually failed at rebuilding the South with the Compromise of 1877, which withdrew federal troops from the southern states, and it also ended Reconstruction era, which made Jim Crow laws rise in the South. Period 6 was all about big business, industrialization, and capitalism, basically. So if you don't know, capitalism is basically when businesses compete against each other. Communism, on the other hand, is when everyone kind of makes the same. They make the same income and there's no competition. Moving on, as I've just said before, industrialism started to rise. For example, with the Transcontinental Railroad being built and steel production being much easier with the Bessemer process, industrialism became a big thing and most of the population started to actually work in factories. 3 big business owners that you should remember are Andrew Carnegie, who was all about steel, John Rockefeller, oil, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroads. So, the reason that these 3 men are really important is because their companies were notorious for being monopolies, which is where one company controls a whole market. And another thing that existed during this time were trusts, which is when several companies work together. These 2 things were extremely bad during this time because it decreased competition. This then led to the Sherman Antitrust Act, which didn't succeed, but it tried to make monopolies and trusts basically illegal. Another important event that occurred during period 6 was the Gilded Age, which was a period of wealth inequality and very corrupt politics. So because urbanization took place, which is where cities became more common as well as factories, this period of wealth inequality was very harmful since a lot of people were factory workers now, which means that they were actually given very low wages and they were also forced to work very long hours. This led to groups like the Knights of Labor to form, which tried to give labor workers more rights. And labor unions were also forming during this time. Like I've said before, another thing that happened during the Gilded Age was very corrupt politics through political machines, which was where politicians gained power through promising immigrants services in exchange for their support. Like, for example, they'd give immigrants housing or jobs. The last very important thing about this era was social Darwinism, which was the idea that natural selection determined only the ones fit to survive became wealthy. This idea was promoted by Charles Darwin, who also promoted the idea of the wealth giving to the poor.